Welcome to the Seattle Hall Pass podcast. Here, we dive deep into the heart of Seattle Public Schools, bringing reports from board meetings, legislative sessions, and other events that impact our education system. We also hope to include interviews with all types of stakeholders along the way. My name is Christie Robertson.
And I'm Jane Tung-Stamel. And between the two of us, we have 4 kids in 4 schools in Seattle Public Schools. We're parents, community members, PTA leaders, and one of us was even a school board candidate.
This is our first episode, which we're calling Well-Resourced Schools. We're going to be discussing the community meetings held at 5 schools around the district.
And though the superintendent said many, many times during these meetings that they're not about closing schools, it was clearly a concern for many people. We'll post the links and the sources of our data in the show notes on hallpass.buzzsprout.com. So what are well-resourced schools anyway? The superintendent says he doesn't have a plan yet, so that's why he's going to the community.
So when we talk about well-resourced schools, we're really talking about how much service are we providing students and what type of programs do we have for students? How are we using our building spaces wisely? As you heard Dr. Torres talk about, we have a strategic plan coming up. We have a levy that we're preparing for. We have budget challenge that we need to manage through and just a daily decision making that we have. So us understanding from community what a system of well-resourced schools are is really important on many fronts.
There were 5 meetings in August throughout Seattle, and Christy and I went to the one at Nathan Hale.
And I also attended the one at Garfield, the first one.
We saw most of the school board directors in attendance, and the way the meetings worked is that they had community members at tables in groups of 6 to 10, and usually they had somebody from the district who was facilitating the conversation.
The 2 that I went to were really well attended. The school board directors and the admin walked around between the tables while people were talking, and the vast majority of the time was spent in conversation.
They focused the conversation on 3 categories, and during the conversation, every community member had Post-its where they could write their thoughts. Everybody went around and shared their thoughts with their table, and at the end of that section, they would put all the Post-its up on a board to consolidate.
We also looked at the Post-it notes from all of the different meetings, so we are trying to convey somewhat of a sense of what happened around the different regions, as well as what we heard at Hale and Garfield.
So we can talk about the 3 categories they focus on. The first one was school buildings and learning spaces. The second one was academic and extracurricular programs. And the last one was support services and resources.
Here's Associate Superintendent Dr. Torres introducing the first topic.
Our first topic is school buildings and learning spaces. Framing question: what are your favorite things about our school buildings?
It was interesting that they focused on school buildings and learning spaces a lot because we're building so many new school buildings. My students went to Sacagawea, and I still have one student there, and that is one of the buildings that needs the most reconstruction. For example, we had a roof last year and buckets in the hallway. But we love our school. But it was really interesting for me hearing other people at my table who talked about their beautiful buildings. There was someone who was at Olympic Hills, which is not too far from Sacagawea, and they have beautiful outdoor light, and the classrooms are clustered into pods. And so it was really interesting to hear what can be when these new buildings come online.
My younger kiddo just finished up 6 years at Thornton Creek, and when we moved in, it was a pretty brand new building. And one of the things that I think made the biggest difference from what I saw my other kid go through was spaces between the classrooms, just like a couple tables and some books and things. So if kids were being pulled out of their classroom to get special education or other support, or if they were working in small groups, they could go to that area. They still felt like they were part of the classroom, but having some space outside the classroom. But other people that had that at their buildings brought that up as well.
What are some of the other things you noticed that people brought up?
People cared about the outside appearance of the building, that it felt good to go into, and just the feel of the school inside. So how is it structured to be welcoming and show the school's spirit.
Yeah, I had a lot of people at my comment about that too. Just feeling like when you walk in the door that you're being welcomed. Everybody gave props to the office staff at all the school sites. Most of them are very welcoming when people come in, and that really makes a difference.
It really does.
I saw that some people were asking to have all cafeteria food made on site. People really enjoy having student art on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
One person noted that old buildings have auditoriums, but the new buildings do not. And related to that, though, people were also talking about good sound systems in the auditoriums. I know, for example, Jane Addams used to be a well-regarded community theater. During the student plays, even when they're wearing mics, you cannot understand what they're saying. So I don't know if in the new buildings they're building auditoriums or not, but there was a few comments about that.
Accessibility concerns were brought up at both of the meetings I went to, and I saw post-its about that, to just build spaces that are designed for people with different needs rather than trying to retrofit. First we build the building and then we figure out how people in wheelchairs are going to get out. With new buildings, we can look to taking everybody's needs into account, make sure the sound systems are accessible to everybody and go along with lights and things like that. Definitely what you'd expect from a well-resourced school.
Yeah. One more thing that people really liked for these well-resourced school buildings is grass and other natural open spaces for the playground, instead of some of the older playgrounds are all asphalt.
And I saw a couple comments that I cheered along to, saying some kind of playground equipment or some kind of recess for middle school kids.
Oh, yes. I saw that.
I know my middle schooler just can't believe they're not going to have recess.
For my middle schooler, they actually do call lunch recess when they're done eating. Some of them go outside onto the field, but it's not staffed. So for a well-resourced school, if you could have some adults out there just to keep everything positive.
One more thing was people brought up inclusion in this area, not having segregated spaces for kids that learn differently. I've seen some building plans that talk about these are the special education rooms. You want to make sure that you're thinking of services as services and not places to stick kids.
Some of what we heard, the idea of green space and or gardens at our schools, the idea of mixed use spaces, the idea of safety. Safety is very important. Mix of old and new school buildings. And finally, student work on display that represents the students of the school.
The next part was academic and extracurricular programs.
Framing question. What kinds of programs do you and or your student value the most and why?
And as far as I know, the extracurricular programs are all funded by PTAs.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that most of them are, or they're self-funded by parents. So like either enrichment or childcare after school are paid for by parents or county programs, that kind of thing. So it's interesting to think about that they are a part of what people think of as a well-resourced school. And obviously that's a bit conflicting with trying to cut costs. I did see a lot about that discrepancy in PTA funding and what can be done about that. That's been an ongoing difficulty. These things that people consider to be a key part of well-resourced schools, like field trips and enrichment, that are only available if your PTA can pay for them. We have a few community groups that are working on some fund sharing, but the vast majority still just goes to the school where people donate money. I think a lot of people don't realize the PTAs are funding them because they just consider them to be a part of a well-resourced school. They don't even realize that there are schools where kids don't go on field trips.
Yeah, and also in the overall scheme of things, the PTA funds is a drop in the bucket, the
Right.
$1 billion plus budget. So that doesn't seem like the answer either.
Also, you can't bring every kind of kid to enrichment that's run by PTA because there isn't support for all kids' needs. People felt field trips and overnights was an important part of well-resourced schools, and I've known a lot of people who have had their kids left out or that they were told that they had to go along if their kid was going to go, and that's definitely not either legal or how it's supposed to be.
And Christy, were those kids that were receiving special education services?
Yes. Often I think it's that It's hard to figure out the special education teachers' availability, and a lot of principals just choose to not deal with it unless somebody insists.
So I'm really glad that the district was asking about extracurricular programs, and I'm hoping maybe we as community members can show them how we think these things are necessary in all schools, and hopefully it can get funded.
Reminder, our topic was support services and resources. Here are some of the themes. Staff for social emotional learning support at schools, more dedicated counselors at the secondary level, and clearer private-public partnerships between our schools, our community-based organizations, and the city of Seattle. Our final conversation and topic of the evening, we're going to talk about academic and extracurricular programs. Framing question. What kinds of programs do you and or your student value the most and why?
So academic and extracurricular programs. What themes did we notice?
People brought up wanting ethnic studies integrated into classes, a full-time librarian, counselor, and art teachers and music teachers.
A few people highlighted there should be no-cut sports for all grades, including elementary school.
That is so true.
Because a lot of times it's that there's only one team, and so only the most skilled players are able to make the team. So some kids just don't even feel like they should try out because there's no point.
Which is really inequitable because who's on the team? It's the ones that it's the little kids.
Or it's the people who are in the private sports teams that cost $1,500 a year, and then they also play on the school team. And so then they're not leaving any spaces for other people.
Advanced learning came up a lot. Not that there necessarily needs to be an extra program, but that kids need access to advanced learning in some way.
Right. Because right now, at least for elementary schools, is that advanced learning is supposed to be served at the neighborhood school. But because there's no curriculum and the teachers aren't necessarily trained to serve all the many levels of needs in the same classroom, those kids often don't get the instruction that they need.
Yeah. And I personally do think that it's possible to teach a lot of different levels in the same class, but it's not a matter of just telling a teacher to differentiate. There's a lot of specific training around universal design for learning, but it takes co-planning, then it takes co-teaching. Personally, I think a well-resourced school would have co-teachers in at least half the classrooms.
But then the thing with that is that then it needs more staffing, and our district has a structural deficit.
So that's why I really, really want to see the breakdown of special education funding, because the spending on special education is going up so much every year. And yet there is so much failure to serve disabled kids. I have to think that it's going to things that aren't effective. If you take money and pour it into dealing with kids who are having a lot of trouble, but you're not actually helping them have less trouble, and then that means you make your general education classes larger, then those kids have an even harder time being in those classrooms because there's more kids and less teacher. And I'll add that one of the things on the agenda for the upcoming board meeting is approval of $10.5 million going to non-public agency schools, which are private schools that serve kids with needs that the district doesn't feel that they can provide for, which oftentimes I think is just dysregulated kids. So I think there's about 100 kids. And I believe a lot of them could be served in our schools if we were doing special education in a more inclusive way. So I just have a really strong sense that that money is not being used effectively.
What's happened, for those of you who don't know, is that the special education budget is about a quarter of the budget. And even the school board directors until recently weren't told how the money was being spent. There was 3 school board directors that told the superintendent that they would not vote to pass the budget unless they got the details on the special education spending. And so then apparently they did give them that information in meetings that they call 2x2s, where it's school board directors and 2 central office staff. But because it wasn't at a public meeting, Christie and I and all the rest of you, community members, we don't know how that spending works. SPS spends about twice what they're given from the state for special ed services. So not to say that the state is adequately funding special education services, but it's just when there's a big overspend from Seattle Public Schools, the legislature just doesn't understand what's going on there. Yeah, and one of the main reasons Christie and I wanted to do this podcast is because we do want to just light information so that we can, as citizens, as voters, go to the state legislature and show them how SPS is spending its money and advocate for more funding.
And back to advanced learning for a minute, I do want to bring up the specific issue of Walk to Math, where kids go to a different classroom at a different level during their math period to get the right level for them. Because a lot of people talked about that math is the hardest thing to really differentiate. Walk to Math seems like one of the least exclusionary ways of providing advanced learning. A couple of people at my table talked about their kids having to repeat the same math curriculum 2 years in a row after Walk to Math was eliminated.
And with the possible ending of the highly capable cohort, that all those students will be back in their neighborhood schools. And so Walk to Math seems a perfect example of how you could have universal design for learning within a school site. That if some students were accelerated in math, they could just go to a different classroom for that time period.
Mm-hmm. One important thing I want to add before we leave academic programs is I heard a lot about the Skills Center when I was running for school board, and I would get asked what's something that you think is really going well at Seattle schools. That's the thing that sticks out to me. Our skills centers are so cool. They have all of these career areas that you can take classes, and they will bus you to schools around the city starting in high school. And they're really inclusive from what I've seen. My kids are just now getting to the age where they could take advantage. So we've never actually experienced the classes, but everything I've heard about them is really great. And I believe they are continually expanding. And there was a lot of support for that among families.
Some other things that were very popular is I think almost universally, everyone wanted to have a full-time librarian at every elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
And also to bring back Jumpstart for kindergartens.
Oh, yeah, I heard that too. And I also heard that everybody wants a counselor at their school, and specifically a counselor that actually does emotional style, not just career advice.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and one more thing that a lot of people mentioned was to have smaller class sizes.
Again, this brings up the issue of what is the point of these meetings, because it's a little funny to go into a room and have them frame it as we have a budget crisis, and then we're all just basically giving our wish list of what we think schools should have to be well-resourced, and what they're actually going to be doing is making cuts. Now, I assume they're going to say, look, you guys all wanted a full-time librarian and a full-time counselor, and in order to do that, we have to close these schools and consolidate them over here, and that they'll just ignore the parts that are more complicated because they can't possibly do all of these things. Here's Superintendent Dr. Brent Jones.
As I mentioned in the last couple of sessions, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And so we want to make sure that we are prioritizing what's important to you.
And every meeting took pains to say that no schools would be closing during the 23 to 24 school year.
There will be no site consolidations and or closures for the 23-24 school year.
There is a state law that they have some minimum time required that you can't close schools in. Another interesting thing about this meetings is that we all know that schools are going to be closing or consolidating, as the district likes to say, but they didn't want to talk about during those meetings at all. And
right.
We also know that they're building lots of very large, brand new buildings for elementary schools that are going to hold 500 students or 650 students. And some of those buildings are even opening. For example, this fall, Viewlands is reopening, and I think it's a 650 student limit. And also James Baldwin Elementary, which was formerly known as Northgate. Both of those schools will be opening this fall. They have 250 or 300 students, and they're in these buildings that can hold twice as many. So part of the district planning all along must have been that they're going to build these new buildings, and since they're twice the size of their old buildings, they'll have to redraw boundaries and perhaps close schools to get those buildings full.
That does make me think, are they going to close the HCC schools or something?
Well, yeah, and then Cascadia could be another neighborhood elementary school for 600 students. I think there's many community members who would love to have their students in a beautiful new building with all these things, natural light, and
that building is amazing.
Yeah, but instead of just saying we're building these new beautiful schools for our students, but then it means that maybe we'll close some of our older buildings, they just don't want to talk about it. So it'll be interesting when the superintendent tells us what his plan is, which they said at all of the meetings that he will be releasing his plan in November.
Yes. And they said a survey will go out in September, and we are super curious to see what that survey is like.
In September of 2023, an electronic survey will be released district-wide to families, high school students, staff, and community partners to gather additional input. While more than 700 individuals have signed up to attend our in-person sessions this summer, we want to follow up with our entire school community. The input gathered will be compiled into a report used to inform decisions on upcoming major SPS initiatives.
Christie and I were wondering how SPS is going to be collating all the data collected. We have a friend who took pictures of all the Post-its and shared it with us. So it'll be interesting to see how the school district interprets that data, and if any of it has an impact on when they announce their plan for well-resourced schools.
Mm-hmm. Or if they're just going to kind of go on a gestalt from how the meetings felt or what they heard when they were walking around.
Yeah, or if they're just going to go with what they think is best.
Right, what they were going to do all along.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious to hear if they heard what they were expecting to, or if they were surprised by anything.
As a reminder, we were on academic and extracurricular programs. Some of the themes we heard are clubs, walk-on sports, student choice in what the programming is, sports in the elementary schools, music, arts, and theater, and more volunteer opportunities.
The third area was support services and resources.
Topic, support services and resources. Framing question, how could we make resources and/or services at each school stronger?
One of the things people mentioned that's near and dear to my heart is staffing to avoid split grade classrooms. Since my student is at a smaller school, I actually think there are advantages to having split grade classrooms, but from what I've heard from the teachers at my student schools is that the district doesn't have a curriculum to support that.
Yeah, I heard that too. I definitely heard language access so that parents who speak limited English can participate fully in their kids' school.
And a great example of language access was recently Manuela Sly came to the school board meeting because at Seattle World School, they were having a graduation and most of those students, the families don't speak English as a first language. So she was advocating that they translate the graduation ceremony for Spanish. So it's things like that so that the families can feel part of the community events at that school.
Yeah. The kind of thing that you're like, they weren't already doing that? Wow.
Yeah.
And free meals for every kid. I heard that a lot.
Yes. And that is something that the state legislature can help pay for that. And I think they're going to try to do that again in the next session.
Yeah. There was a bill for that in this last one, but it got kind of gutted. I'm sure they'll try again. And before and after school care. I heard that mentioned a lot too and saw that on the Post-its.
Yeah, because right now, especially in elementary schools, they don't have enough staff to have after-school care for every child that needs it. And so that definitely becomes an equity issue for any family that has 2 full-time working caretakers. We need to have after-school care for our children.
Or 1 full-time.
Yes.
Reminder, our topic was support services and resources. Here are some of the themes. Staff for social-emotional learning support at schools, more dedicated counselors at the secondary level, and clearer private-public partnerships between our schools, our community-based organizations, and the city of Seattle.
One thing I thought was interesting, when they were passing the 23-24 budget for the school year that's just about to start, the projections were that around $50 million would be the deficit for the 24-25 school year. But then I noticed that all of these well-resourced school meetings that Superintendent Jones said that it would actually be a $105 million deficit for the 24-25 school year.
We are at a financial crossroads. This last year, 23-24 planning, we had a $131 million budget deficit. This coming year that we have to prepare for is a $105 million deficit.
And so I'm wondering, why is there the $50 million difference? Because they balanced the budget for the year that's just about to start. And one of the ways they did balance that is that they spent the entire rainy day fund. So now there's $0 in the rainy day fund.
I couldn't believe they did that. It's like zero? Really? You don't want to leave just like a car wreck amount of money in there?
And it makes you really wonder, what's the plan? Because when they decided to use the rainy day fund, they could already see that the next year was going to be like 53 million, 54 million. They were going to need it for the following school year. And then now Superintendent Jones is saying 105 million. And as we know, there's a capital budget, the general education budget. There's so many different budgets. So I'm sure there's an explanation for it, but I just don't know what it is.
Well, they cut the central staff drastically.
Oh, yeah. Seattle Public Schools, we're not the only one in this position. The school districts have to make central office cuts every year, it seems like, because the legislature is underfunding our schools. Some districts in Washington State would publish the list of positions that they cut. And I actually sent that to the school board directors and asked, could Seattle do that too? But I think they never did. They should have that information for everybody. And one of the positions they cut does public records requests. And that would be the person that can help us get all this information.
I meant to ask you, you looked up the laws around what has to happen for a school to close. Do you want to talk a little about that?
Actually, the Seattle Public Schools have their own board policy for school closures. So we can talk about that. And Christie and I have been wondering, when are they going to announce these school closures? The last school board meeting for the present board is November 15th. And we're wondering, are they going to vote on it with this present school board, or is it going to be something that happens after the new school board is seated, which is in November 29th?
So they said that Dr. Jones would introduce his plan in November. And I assume this is not going to be one where they do introduction and action in the same meeting. So I would guess they wouldn't vote on it until December.
Yeah. And so then part of the board policy for school closures says that there has to be public review of the superintendent's preliminary recommendation for school closures, and that there has to be a minimum of 30 days for that to happen. Then there would be public hearings for each proposed school site that may be closed, and that when possible, the public hearing would be held at the affected school. And also that there would be a public review of the superintendent's final recommendation for school closures, and that would be a minimum of 14 days. And then the school board has to wait at least 7 days after the public hearing to vote, and between 7 and 90 days, they have to vote on that.
So that's really interesting. And I assume that that means they're planning on doing those hearings in later winter.
And then what happens if the new school board directors come in and some of them may not approve of the school closures? So it's really interesting to see what happens. My assumption was that they were going to try to get it done with the current board because they know that the current board majority would probably vote to support the closures.
There's no way they could pass it through in that amount of time. I really hope they make it clear what they base their choices on. I did a spreadsheet of the numbers of different vulnerable populations at the schools versus the attendance at those schools. And as I suspected, a lot of the smaller schools have one or another population that they are serving, or many, that part of the reason that those kids are there is maybe because the school is smaller and that they have more access to a more intimate environment and lower ratios, that kind of thing. So I hope that they are going to have some way to take that into account. And it's not just the equity measures either, which is, of course, really important to make sure that this doesn't overly affect students furthest from educational justice. Jane is going to post a link to an article that talks about how those kids are often the most affected, but also kids that have particular needs, such as kids who have different gender identities that need to be at a more welcoming school or have had difficulty or bullying, or even kids who have different sensory needs or just difficulty with disciplinary systems. And oftentimes those kids just really need a smaller, more intimate environment. And I've heard Liza Rankin talk about this a lot, that there are some schools that are small on purpose and some that are small by accident. There certainly are schools that are small that aren't serving any of those vulnerable populations. And I hope that they would go to those before the others. But there's other things that might be harder to quantify, like what is the role that school is serving in that community environment? Or what are closures going to do in terms of transportation and walkability? And so all of those things are going to be really hard to take into account, but very important to take into account. So I really hope they are. My fear is that they're looking at a spreadsheet that has to do with librarians and counselors and art teachers and not this other stuff.
Yeah, and some of the small schools are actually not under-enrolled. A lot of times people just point to the schools with fewer than 200 students or fewer than 300 students and say they're under-enrolled. But for example, Sacagawea is my neighborhood school and there's 200 students there, but the capacity is 220 students. So it's really not under-enrolled. It's a small neighborhood school and that's how it is. But because the way the state funding is with the prototypical school model, they want to just build these bigger schools.
Right. And then I wonder what they do with the smaller ones.
So the building condition, that's something that we should learn more about, because so many of the buildings have just been ignored for decades that they have to tear them down basically and build new ones. And they do have some in the school board policy for school closures. It does say that the superintendent will have to share what the criteria for school closures are.
Okay.
And they also have to consider demographic and integration effects. So I'm sure they will try to protect the schools that are in, say, the south end of the city or where there's a higher population of students furthest from educational justice.
Yeah. Seattle, since that's one of their primary goals, hopefully they'll do better about that than other districts. But another thing we should point out that I hope that they address is that closing schools oftentimes doesn't have the budgetary impact that's expected, that there are costs that are really hard to take into account. And also when school closures happened before, they ended up having to reopen them a few years later. So that's expensive to close and reopen schools and move kids and remove them. So presumably there's somebody thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we hope everybody listening can ask the district to share with us exactly how much money they think they'll be saved by closing schools. They have on their 3-year budget says $28 million will be saved by closing schools. But then Chief Operating Officer Fred Podesta said on the KUOW interview that $28 million was actually a speculative number, that they actually don't know how much money will be saved, but that would be a number that they would like to save. And when he was pressed by the reporter about what would be the savings, he wasn't able to really say anything tangible, in my opinion. He mentioned that there would be less deliveries, like a food delivery would have to go to one less school site.
I'm kind of glad he was honest about not being sure about those numbers, but it also makes me wonder how they're going to deal with the other 3/4 of the deficit. I've heard board directors and administrators deny that the closures are tied to budget at all, which seems really disingenuous to me.
Well, I think that might be partly because they're building these big new buildings and they're going to be half empty, for example, this school year, Viewlands and James Baldwin. So in that way, maybe it isn't related to budget cuts. maybe they're just thinking that might make people agree with the decision to close schools more, or they might get more community buy-in if they position it that way.
I mean, they've brought up the deficit at every one of the meetings. Have you ever heard any other proposal for how they're going to save money? I haven't heard anything but this.
No, and also they say it would save about $1 million per year per school site to close a school. But I don't know what that number is based on. And what I hope to do when they're presenting these plans to close schools is show us how this money is being saved, because they still need the same amount of teachers. Maybe they only need one principal instead of two principals, if two small schools merge. But besides for that, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of staffing that would be saved.
And I assume that number takes into account the cost of the closing and whatever they need to keep the building from falling into the ground, and all the money it's going to take to reroute all those kids and the community engagement.
Yeah, I don't know if they have that information, but let's ask them.
Absolutely.
And with that, there's certainly a lot to think about and so much to learn. As you may have noticed, it's sometimes really hard to get information about Seattle Public Schools, and that's exactly why we started this podcast.
We wanted to learn as much as we can, and we wanted to share it with all of you. And if you're the sort of person who has made it this far, then we want to hear from you. Email us at seattlehallpass@gmail.com.
We'd love to interview you if you're part of the Seattle school community. Everyone, including parents, teachers, staff, school board members, and even central office staff.
I'm Christy Robertson.
And I'm Jane Tung-Stamel. Thanks for joining us.
We'll be back with more episodes soon, and we hope you'll join us next time on Seattle Hall Pass.